Hello, welcome back to Speech 101. So I was just talking about speaking and hearing, and now I'm going to move on to introduce you to phonetics and phonology. And we're going to do that by kicking off with sounds and symbols. In other words, how is it that scientists have developed schemes to capture some of the essential characteristics of spoken language? So let's talk about writing for a moment. So writing is a technology. You may not have thought about it that way before, but it's something that human beings have invented in the dim and distant past, and it's essentially a communication aid. It allows information to be captured, and it can be transmitted over space, or it can be stored over time. The basic unit of all writing systems is the word, because the word is the sort of minimal unit of meaning. Because with words we can name objects and we can institute actions. And so utterances, not sentences by the way, but utterances are made up from sequences of words. And different languages depict words in different ways. Some use alphabets, some use syllabaries, logographs or ideographs. So although there are many different writing systems, only some of them reflect the sounds that are made. Some are more related to a sort of pictorial representation of images. And it should also be noted that actually quite a lot of languages don't have a writing system at all. Anyway, writing systems that use alphabets and syllabaries are phonetic. In other words, they're mostly based on how words sound. Okay, and I'm sure since many of you have different language backgrounds, you'll be very well aware that a language like English, there is a very huge distance between how things are sound, how the words sound, and how they are written, and that is a major barrier to learning how to write English. Whereas in other languages like Korean, Finnish, there's a very close relationship between the writing system and the sounds of the language. In fact, Korean's a particularly interesting example because that system was created by a king precisely to create a writing system which was easy for his population to use. Okay, so let's look at sound-based writing systems. And you can think of it as a kind of visible speech. In other words, trying to make speech available to people who can read. And indeed, that was the name of a sound-based writing system that Alexander Graham Bell's father invented. So Alexander Melville Bell, so Alexander Graham Bell, of course, the inventor of the telephone, but his father, and indeed his mother, was hearing impaired. And so Alexander Melville Bell was trying to come up with any kind of help for his wife, and came up with a system of writing which allowed him to communicate. And so that was the original intention of a sort of phonetic-based writing system to help hearing impaired people. And in this particular case, the symbols were represented sort of positions of the vocal organs. Which meant it didn't really matter what language or dialect you were speaking. It was a truly language universal phonetic system. And that's indeed what we have now. So many years ago, as you can see in the late 1800s, the International Phonetic Association was founded. And this is the association which maintains an inventory of all the symbols that are needed to characterize speech, spoken language. So there are about 200 to 300 basic sounds in speech. These are known as phones. And the IPA has come up with a bunch of symbols for representing any sound in any language. And if you're a trained phonetician, then you can transcribe any spoken utterance from any language, even one you've never heard before, or any speaker, using these symbols, because they're characterizing the sounds and writing them down using these special symbols. And indeed, the convention is that a phonetic transcription using these special symbols is written in square brackets. So I've got two examples here, both in English. So we've got hello is written phonetically, and you can see there as hello in square brackets with some funny symbols that you may not have seen before if you're not familiar with phonetics. And then we have speech processing, again, transcribed using some familiar and some unfamiliar symbols between square brackets. So the square brackets, and you will find this in dictionaries and what have you, this is the convention for capturing the phonetics. Now, I'm going to talk about this later, but just a strong warning here. These sounds in all different languages are known as phones. That is a correct term. They are not phonemes. Repeat, they are not phonemes. I'll be defining phonemes in a little while. So if you use the word phone, you're safe. It refers to any sound in any language. Okay, so you might think the International Phonetic Alphabet, with all its symbols, is, many, many books worth of information. In fact, it's all captured in one side of A4 paper. And this is it. I realise you can't quite see the detail, but we'll look closely at it in a moment. But this captures the entire International Phonetic Alphabet, just one sheet of paper. It's quite a staggering achievement, and has taken quite some years to come to this position. So just to talk you around the chart, all the consonants are in that table at the top. We're going to look at that in a moment, and the vowels are here, and there's a bunch of other things we won't worry ourselves with just now. So let's look at that that consonant table. And in here you can see quite a lot of symbols representing all the different consonants that occur in all the world's languages. Some of the symbols are familiar, so if you look at the top left you can see a p and a b. Those sounds occur in many, many languages. But then we've got some quite exotic symbols representing other different sounds, some of which exist in one language and others in other languages. So for example, if I annotate this with English, so these are the English consonants. So we've got, just p, b, t, d, k, g, and the one on the right, which looks like a question mark, that's the glottal stop, that's and then we've got some consonants in the middle, f, v, th, the, s, z, sh, zh. Okay, so these are familiar sounds to any English speaker, and those of you who are non-native English speakers, you'll have more or less difficulty learning some of these sounds. So those are the English consonants. So it's a subset. So every language is essentially sampling this table. So, for example, here's Cantonese. So Cantonese is a slightly different subset. It shares some in common with English, and others are different. So that's consonants. Let's now have a look at the vowels. So we've got this interesting quadrilateral. It's called a quadrilateral, the vowel quadrilateral. An interesting shape here. And we've got many, many symbols representing all the different vowels in all the different languages. But if I annotate that with English, then here we have the standard English vowels, e, a, o, etc. And again, depending on which language you speak, it will determine which vowels you're used to using. So if you are speak an Arabic language, you only have a few vowels, just the three there. So some languages have more consonants and less consonants, and and the same with vowels. Some have more vowels and some have fewer vowels. Okay, so that gives you a basic feel for the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. So let's look at sound systems in general now. And there are two key aspects that we're going to be talking about. The first is phonetics. And this is essentially studying the physics of the sound systems. So what's going on in the auditory system, acoustic phonetics and articulatory phonetics. We're going to be discussing that in a minute. And this was termed many, many years ago. I think this has gone out of fashion, but I really like it. This is what's known as the language-independent physiophonic description of the sounds of speech. Okay, it relates to physics, as it were, as opposed to phonology. So phonology is more about how the sounds are used. It's the function, how they're distributed, and something called contrast, which we will be coming to. And the fact we've got these two areas is a source of much confusion. And a lot of people don't even realize that these are importantly different areas. And again, picking up on this old description, the phonology of a language was described as psychophonic. So this is language dependent. The phonology of a sound system is language dependent. And the reason it says that it has this psychophonic term is because there are sort of psychological aspects to one's perception of sounds in that area. All will be explained when I come to that in a moment. But it's a useful distinction, physiophonic versus psychophonic. Okay, so let's go physiophonic. And we'll start off with articulatory phonetics. So this is a whole area of study. There are experts in articulatory phonetics. And it's essentially about the description of speech sounds in terms of their physical actions, in terms of the physical actions performed in their production. So we've already seen pictures of the anatomy. I've stripped away some of the descriptors here so we can just see the anatomy itself. And we're going to label it with various key things. So first of all, the resonances. You know from the previous talk or earlier in this tutorial about resonances. So there are essentially four main resonances. There's the laryngeal cavity, which is right above the vocal folds. The pharyngeal cavity, which is right at the back of the mouth and higher up than the laryngeal cavity. Then you've got the main oral cavity, which is just inside here, and the nasal cavity, which is quite large. Now, large, but hard to vary. So those are the cavities. Then we have the articulators. So these are the pieces of anatomy that are either moving around or involved in movements, and there's a lot of them. And that's because the human vocal apparatus is incredibly rich in possibilities. For example, compared to a regular mammal. I don't have time to go into the history of all that, but there is an interesting set of a discussion to be had about just what is different about the human vocal apparatus compared to all other animals. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all this in great detail, but just so as you can see that there are various different parts of the vocal tract which are implicated in making different sounds. So we've obviously got the tongue, the lips, teeth. I will draw your attention to the one that's labelled alveolar ridge. So just behind your teeth, you can feel there's a sort of a hard ridge. That is known as the alveolar ridge. And because it's a sort of a hard physical structure in an important place in the vocal tract, it's used in many different ways to make different sounds, and therefore those sounds are used in many different languages. It turns out to be quite an important anatomical feature. Then we've got the palate. The velum, I mentioned already, as the piece of your anatomy which is capable of opening and closing the airflow into the nose. The uvula is the thing dangling down. You can see at the back of your throat. And then, of course, the vocal cords. So those are the articulators. Now, the most important articulator is the tongue. And from an articulatory phonetics point of view, it's normal to refer to 5 different parts of it. The tongue tip is very dexterous and is placed in different positions. The blade, the front, the back, and the root. The tongue is actually a muscular hydrostat. What that means is that it's like a bag of liquid. It's a 3D muscle structure, and if it's one of the most complicated muscles in the human body. So, for example, not only can you pull it around, but also if you compress the muscles inside the structure, for example, because it's a constant volume, you can cause it to shoot out and make amazing movements. And just for your interest, other muscular hydrostats include an octopus's tentacle and an elephant's trunk. And you can see, how, those are incredibly dexterous pieces of anatomy. Okay, so let's then talk about speech, and let's first mention the syllable. So the syllable is the shortest stretch of speech. Now, it could be just a single vowel sound, as in E, right? But a syllable typically consists of vowels, which are sounds where there's no blockage, no obstruction at all, so clear vocal sounds. And then there are consonants. Consonants are when there is some kind of obstruction. It could be complete obstruction of the airflow or a partial obstruction with turbulence. And a very simple syllable would be a consonant vowel consonant, as in pot, for example. And that sort of CVC arrangement basically corresponds to opening and closing the mouth. Right, the jaw lowers and then rises again. So words are made up of syllables. They can be monosyllabic, in other words, only having one syllable, or they can be polysyllabic, which simply means having two or more syllables. Interestingly, the word monosyllabic is polysyllabic, of course. There are more than one syllable in monosyllabic. Okay, so let's move on to talk about speech sounds themselves. How do we classify them? Well, how do we classify sounds in articulatory phonetics? Well, there are a whole bunch of features here that we need to describe. Where the sound is coming from, whether the air is going in or out, whether the vocal cords are vibrating, if there's a constriction, where is it? How is the sound being made? What's the tongue doing? And what are the lips doing? So all these features are important and essentially shape the sound using the principles that I talked about already in the tutorial. So let's look at consonants for the moment, and we can essentially use three dimensions to characterize consonants. The first dimension is voicing, whether the vocal cords are vibrating or not. So if they're vibrating, that is described as a voiced sound or a voiced consonant. And if they're not vibrating, then it's a voiceless consonant. So s is voiceless, but z is voiced. Now, it's possible to have degrees of voicing, so you can have partially voiced sounds as well. Also, there's something called voice quality. So a normal voice is referred to as modal, but you can also have creaky voices, falsetto voices, breathy voices. And this is all different muscular tensions around the vocal cords, causing them to vibrate in slightly different ways with more or less turbulence and what have you. And hopefully you recognize that these are all different types of voices that it's possible for you to make. Excuse me. The second dimension for characterizing consonants is the place of articulation. So this is where, if there's a constriction, which for a consonant there will be, where is the constriction in the vocal tract? And we're going to look at that in a moment in a bit more detail. And then the third dimension is manner, the way in which the airstream is being modified by the articulators, and just how much narrowing, if there's some kind of constriction, how much of that do we have? Okay, so let's pretty much talk through voice already, so let's look at place. So there are many different places of articulation. So these are literally physical places within the vocal tract where you can create a constriction and block the flow. So they're quite technical words, right? Bilabial, labiodental, dental, all the way down to glottal. But the easy thing to remember here is that actually that list essentially corresponds to lots of different places, starting at the lips and working your way back down the vocal tract, down the oral cavity, towards the vocal cords. And so here we are. So here is a bunch of, the same list of places of articulation, and this table tells you which articulators are involved. So bilabial, as it sounds, involves the two lips, the upper and the lower lips. So a bilabial consonant means that the lips, the two lips are forming a closure, and so those are the sounds p, b, and m. Very, very simple. Then we've got labiodental. So that is you can hopefully tell from the description, labio is the lip, dental is teeth. So this is something to do with the lips and the teeth. Indeed, it's the lower lip against the upper front teeth, and that is f and v. Okay, and then we've got dental, which is the tongue tip, which I did mention, against the upper front teeth, th and the. That, of course, is a common sound in English, but not so common in other languages, and therefore quite hard, to learn. Then we've got this alveolar ridge that I mentioned. So an alveolar place of articulation is when the tongue tip or the blade presses against that ridge just behind the teeth. And you can see that there are many sounds you can make there. T, d, n, l, s, z. So just try that at home. And although there are different sounds there, your tongue is touching the alveolar ridge in exactly the same way in each of those sounds. And so it goes on. I won't go through all of them, and we end up down at the glottis in the larynx, where we've got the glottal stop, which is the question mark, and the H, which is where we're holding the vocal folds apart, blowing the air through and creating quite a lot of turbulence. That's the sound. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what place of articulation is about. Manner of articulation, as I say, this is more to do with how the sound is produced. So there are different types here. We have the first type is when there's a complete blockage. So if you close your lips or you press your tongue against, for example, the palate, there will be a complete blockage in the oral cavity. Now, depending on what the velum is doing, you get different things happening. If the velum is up and therefore the nasal cavity is closed, and you have a closure in your oral cavity, and then you attempt to, then you use your lungs to generate air pressure, no air is going to escape, and therefore there will be a build-up of pressure. Then if you release the pressure, you'll get a little explosion. So that's why we have this term plosives. So p, t, k, b, d, g are all of that type. The nasal cavity is closed, the oral cavity is closed momentarily, there's a build-up of pressure, and then there's a release. If the release is a bit slower, you get more turbulence. So these are known as affricates, so this is ch and j. And if the velum is not up, but it's down, which means there is airflow through the nasal cavity, then if you, for example, cause a blockage at the alveolar ridge, you will get an n sound, and if you have a blockage at the lips, you get a m sound. Air is coming through the nose and shaping the sound in that way. So those are all stops, complete blockage, but you still might have airflow through the nose. Then we've got fricatives. So fricatives are when you have a small opening, so the articulators are coming together, but not quite enough to stop the airflow. And because there's a narrow opening, there's going to be turbulence and therefore noise. And so this is how you create sounds like f, s, and sh. All right, all these fricative sounds. Then we have sounds where there is a narrowing, but it's not narrow enough to cause turbulence. So these are sounds like all, w, v, and y. These are known as, so all is a lateral sound because actually the tongue is touching, but it's lowered at the side. So the air is coming out of the side of the tongue and then out of the front of the mouth. And then the glides like w, y, r. And then we have slightly more exotic sounds, the taps and the trills. So a tap is when you do get a complete closure, but it's very brief. As an American would say, butter. That T in butter is a very, very short tap of the tongue against the palate. Or it could be more sustained. as in R, which is the sort of Scottish R sound. That would be a trill. Okay, so that's so we've done voice place manner, and now back to the chart. And I didn't draw your attention to this before, but let me do so now. This chart is organised along those very lines. So first of all, voicing, you probably did notice that in a lot of the chart entries here there are two symbols, and that's because the left symbol is voiceless and the right hand symbol is voiced. So top left corner we've got P where there's no voicing and B where there is voicing. Okay, so the pairs of symbols just indicate whether the vocal cords are vibrating or not. The place, you were probably already ahead of me here and noticed that that's what the horizontal axis of this table is. So all those places of articulation that I mentioned correspond to the headings of the columns. And then, surprise, surprise, the rows here correspond to the manner of production. So that consonant table in the IPA is organised along this voice place manner set of dimensions, which is a really helpful way of understanding how you make these different sounds. Okay, let's so now turn to vowels. So vowels, obviously, there is no obstruction. That's more or less the definition of a vowel. It's a clear, open sound, but you can still move your articulators. So you move your tongue around and you can shape your lips, and that changes the sound by filtering, just as we saw earlier. That is the terminology as we talk about the vowel quality is altered by the positions of those articulators. So to classify this or to formalize it, vowel quality is governed by essentially three things. What's called the height of the vowel, whether it's high or low, that essentially means whether the tongue is high or low in the mouth. The vowel location, which is referred to as front-back, and that's essentially whether the tongue is near the front of the mouth or the back of the mouth. And the lip positions, whether they're rounded or unrounded. So this is an unrounded position, this is a rounded position, and of course all of these are continuous. So whereas consonants tend to be a bit more discrete because they involve absolute positions and closures, vowels is a continuous space because your tongue can be anywhere in the high, low, or front back space. Likewise with your lips. And I just draw attention to the fact that the mid-central vowel, which is the noise that comes out of your mouth when you sort of don't do anything, it's got a special name. And it's got this upside down E symbol, and it's got a special name, which is schwa, which you may have heard about. So here is the vowel quadrilateral again. And again, you can probably immediately see that this is organized along those dimensions that I was just introducing you to. So the height is here. So we've got high and low, slightly different terminology. Sometimes we talk about close and open rather than high and low. That's what's on the IPA chart. But it's basically to do with the tongue position. And then we've got front and back. That's the location of the tongue, whether it's far forwards or far back. And the pairs of symbols at each point correspond to rounded and unrounded. So, for example, the one that's indicated there, where we've got the I and the Y symbols, so the I symbol would be E, whereas the Y symbol would be E. So the tongue is forward and high, but the lips are rounded. For those native English speakers, that is the vowel that occurs in French, which we find so hard to do. But maybe with a bit of phonetics training, you could get it. And there's schwa sitting right bang in the middle, neutral vowel. Okay, so that's articulatory phonetics. Now let's move on to acoustic phonetics. So acoustic phonetics is a description of speech sounds in terms of the acoustic consequences of their production. So not so much about the anatomy now, but more about the kind of acoustic measurements that we might be able to make. So what are acoustic consequences? Well, we've seen all these already. So they're waveforms, spectra, and spectrograms. So that's how we would study sounds from the acoustics acoustic phonetics point of view. So to make that easy, we're going to start with some sounds which can be sustained. So these are known as continuants. That obviously makes analysis, or to understand them very easy. So all monophthong vowels are of course continuants, because you can, as long as you can hold your breath, you can maintain that quality of sound. All the fricatives, sh, right? Some of the approximants like l, and all the nasals. That last one, by the way, with the end with a dangle at the end, that is excuse me. Okay, so let's look at some vowels. In fact, now this is an ancient data set, very famous, one of the earliest collections of measurements of vowels, Peterson and Barney data, and I've plotted them here. So what they did is they recorded all these vowels from, as you can see, 33 male speakers. They're actually Americans. Recorded all the vowels and measured the first and second formants. So you've got the first formant on the horizontal axis there. Those are in hertz. And likewise, the vertical axis is the second formant, the second resonance of the oral cavity. And those are also in hertz. And you can see an interesting plot. And all the different vowels have been portrayed in different colours. So you can see that the different vowels more or less occupy different places. There's some clustering in this space. But what I want to do now is is some transformations of this space, just something very obvious. So this is what we're just looking at. It's a F1, F2 space, but I want to rotate this clockwise. So here we go. So now we've got F2 along the horizontal axis and F1 on the vertical axis. Now I want to reverse the horizontal axis. So we've still got F1 on the vertical axis, but F2 is on the horizontal axis. And so low frequency F1 is the top, high frequency F1 is at the bottom, low frequency F2 is at the right, high frequency F2 is in the left. Now, why have I gone to the trouble of doing that transformation? Because I want to overlay that on this. And hey presto, it reveals immediately why the vowel quadrilateral is organized the way it is, why it's displayed the way it is, why it's a sort of quadrilateral shape even. It has that sort of triangular structure to it. And you can see that the vowels actually line up very nicely. So the dark blue top left-hand corner is the E, right, and the lighter blue and the top right is the U. And it all fits very, very nicely. So that tells us something really rather important, which is that the organization of the vowel system in the IPA is very highly correlated with the first and second formant resonances. And that's not surprising, is it? Because that is the acoustic structure which is being modified. And the early phoneticians and that relates directly to the position of the tongue. There's a direct relation between the position of the tongue, the shape of the cavity, and therefore the resonant frequencies of that cavity. Okay, so let's look at a few vowels then in different forms. So here's a spectrogram of the E vowel, and here's a spectrum. So this is a long-term spectrum, which of course, because that vowel is sustained, it's very easy to compute, and we get a nice smooth result of the long-term spectrum over that vowel. And what we can see in that analysis is we've got a very low F1 here, right? And then there's a big gap, and then we've got a very high F2. We've also got F3 and F4 and F5, but we're not worried about those for the moment. But with a low F1 and a high F2, we know that on the vowel chart puts us here, and indeed that's where E is, right? So low F1 is high, and high F2 is front, exactly what you'd expect. So we can do that. Let's do that for one more vowel. Here's R. So the R vowel, you can see the spectrogram, and you can also see the long-term spectrum. In the long-term spectrum, we have a high F1, Okay, and there it is on both plots, and we have a low F2. So if we're high F1 must mean that we're towards the bottom of the vowel chart, low F2 must mean we're towards the right, which indeed is exactly where R is. Okay, so it all just showing that it all ties up together. So this is something trivial now, but what happens when you have two vowels joined together? So this is ER. You saw this when I demonstrated the spectrogram live. So what you can see here, obviously, is the two formants. There's, you can see many formants. They're all moving, but if you look at the F1 and F2, they start off far apart because F1 is low and F2 is high. But then F1 goes high, F2 goes low. They come very close together. And in the vowel chart, we're basically transiting from the top left to the bottom right. All very straightforward. So let's look at some fricatives then. So remember, fricative is when you have a narrow opening giving rise to turbulence, turbulent sound. And what you can see here is on the top plot spectrograms of some voiceless fricatives. So you can see there's pretty much not... Well, first of all, you see different noise shapes in the spectra, but you can also see there's hardly any energy at the low frequencies, and that's because the vocal cords are not vibrating. So that's f, th, s, and sh. But at the bottom, we've got the same place of articulation, but with the voiced versions. And you can indeed see some voicing in the low frequencies. So that's v, the, z, and j. Okay, let's now turn to some nasals. So this is m, n, and ng. And again, we've got the long-term spectra. And the interesting thing about nasals, of course, is that you've got the nasal cavity resonating. And the nasal cavity is quite long compared to the oral cavity. So a long tube, you'll remember, has a lower resonant frequency. And that's exactly what we see. So we see this extra resonance, which is known as a nasal formant, when we have these nasal stops. Okay, so those are easy to analyze because they're stationary. Let's look at some non-stationary sounds. So, of course, most speech is non-stationary, but typical non-stationary sounds would be diphthongs. By the way, a diphthong like a, o, ow, it's pronounced diphthong, not diphthong. I should have put a warning message. Diphthong is the correct pronunciation of that word. All the plosives, of course, are non-stationary because of the explosive nature, putaka. The affricates, ch, as we saw before, and the glides, w, y. All these sounds are characterized by a change. So it's not possible to say, to pick a piece of acoustics and say this corresponds to this sound. The essence of these sounds is that the sound is changing. The essence of these phones, I should say. So here we've got some plosives in vowel context, so we can see the movement. We've got voiceless on the top, arpa, arta, arka, and voiced at the bottom, arba, arda, argar. Now, interestingly, the difference between voiced and voiceless when it comes to plosives is subtly different and very interesting. It's not so much to do with whether the vocal cords are vibrating, it's more about when they start vibrating. So if you look at arta versus arda, and the reason we're comparing those is because they have the same place of articulation, you'll notice I've actually arranged all of these so that the explosion, the burst, lines up. And you can see that in arta, the voicing starts much later than it does in arda. And that is what generates the percept of the difference between the voiced and voiceless consonants, plosives in this case. So voiced plosives have a much shorter voice onset time, VOT. You would hear a phonetician talking about VOTs. Okay, so now you're all expert phoneticians. What do you make of this? So I'll give you a second to contemplate. So it's obviously a spectrogram of something. Let me give you a clue. Right. So very similar looking pattern. But what's going on there? Well, you've seen that before. That is actually a spectrogram of the word spectrogram. Right, so what's going on the top? Well, hopefully some of you have realized that we seem to be missing voicing. It's all very noisy. So what does it mean to have a word spoken with no voicing? It means it's whispered. Spectrogram. Okay? There's no voicing. So that just illustrates an important difference between a different speaking mode. Okay. Now, coarticulation. This is a term you may have heard, and indeed it does refer to how one sound influences another. If you're more on the technology side, you will probably think of this as some form of context dependency. If you're more on the phonetic side, then you're probably more appreciative of this behaviour as a consequence of motor planning, and in fact efficient motor planning. Now this is really important because a lot of technologists simply make a very simple assumption that coarticulation is a short range effect. Just, one sound affects the next. Well, of course, that is true. However, to a phonetician, coarticulation is a much richer phenomenon. It has long-range implications. So, for example, if there is a nasalized sound coming up several syllables in the future, and it doesn't matter to any of the intermediate sounds whether there's nasalization or not, it just saves a bit of energy to add that nasalization or it could be lip rounding or something earlier. And that colours the sound. And so you get these long-range effects. So it's really important for everybody to realise co-articulation is not just about adjacency. It's about dependencies over different timescales. So let's have a look at actually a spectrogram of some typical piece of speech here. So this is the utterance, "Why are you early, you owl?" Now you only have to say this to yourself to appreciate that this is a beautifully continuous sound sequence. Even calling it a sequence is a bit odd, right? And visually you can see, it's very hard to draw lines here. Now phonetically, then obviously we can transcribe it. "Why are you early, you owl?" But when it comes to asking the question, and where are these sounds? Well, it's all a bit vague. And that tells you something about what's coming up later. This just shows that the whole idea of segmenting speech is a bit of an oddity, because that appears to be more of a perceptual phenomenon, not an acoustic phenomenon. So we have all the information in the acoustics, but we don't have explicit boundaries in the acoustics. We have structure, but we don't have those cues. And it's the perceptual processes which create order out of this. So that is indeed a good time for a break while you contemplate all of that.